When you picture surviving a brutal winter on the open prairie, you think about firewood, stacking it, splitting it. How many cords a family needs to make it from November to March? That is the equation everyone solves: more fuel, longer survival. But the equation is missing a variable. It does not account for what the house does with the heat once the fire makes it. A cabin built from logs with open seams and sharp corners does not lose heat slowly. The wind finds every gap and runs through it like a hand reaching in. The thing that killed people was not the cold. It was a house that gave the warmth back faster than the stove could make it. This is a story about a man who understood that and bet his daughter's life on it. Martin Hale had buried his wife on a Tuesday. The ground above the White River was not yet summer hard, and he dug the hole himself while his daughter sat on the wagon bench and watched the shovel bite the clay. Sarah had died 3 days earlier from a fever that came on fast after a difficult river crossing and left nothing behind but a sweat-soaked quilt and a 12-year-old girl who had not spoken since. The settlement had no doctor. The nearest surgeon was 40 miles east and charged in cash. Martin had neither the miles nor the cash, so he buried Sarah on the rise where the prairie grass bent in the wind and the river curved below, and he stacked river stones over the grave because he did not have lumber to spare for a marker. That was July of 1880. The claim was filed. The half-finished one-room cabin sat on a shallow rise, a quarter-mile from the river, its logs rough-cut and poorly chinked, its roof unfinished on the south side where Martin had run out of split shakes. Its door hung on leather straps that had already started to stretch in the heat. He had chosen the site because the cut bank sheltered the approach from the northwest wind and because cottonwood grew thick enough along the water to promise fuel. He had chosen wrong on both counts. The cottonwood was soft. It burned fast and threw sparks and left behind ash that crumbled to nothing. And the cut bank did not shelter the cabin. In summer, yes, but in winter, when the prevailing wind shifted and drove hard across the open plain, the cut bank funneled the gale into a channel that hit the cabin's north face like water through a nozzle. He had $6 in coin stored in a tobacco tin under the floorboard. One mule named Peck, old and sound but not fast. 2 milk goats that had survived the crossing from Nebraska. A patched stove with a cracked flue collar that he had sealed twice with river clay and ash. A daughter who needed feeding, and roughly 1.5 cords of usable cottonwood split and stacked against the east wall, where the first real drift of winter would bury it under snow. There was nowhere to go. Martin had no kin west of the Appalachians. His brother in North Carolina had written once in 3 years, and the letter had said, "Do not come." The fare back east cost more than he owned. Sarah was in the ground on the rise, and a man did not leave his wife's grave to the coyotes and the weather. Martin Hale had come to Dakota Territory to build something. Now he would stay in Dakota Territory because leaving meant admitting that the thing he had built was a grave. The fall of 1880 arrived early and wrong. By September, old men in the settlement were watching the sky with tight mouths and saying nothing useful. Geese moved south 3 weeks ahead of schedule. The grass dried brittle before it should have. A cold snap in early October killed the late garden plantings across 3 claims, and the wind that followed stripped what warmth the soil had stored. Teamsters on the freight road reported ice on the Missouri before anyone expected it. A driver named Parch said he had not seen ice that early in 11 years on the route, and Parch was not a man given to exaggeration. Martin heard the talk and understood what it meant. A hard winter was coming, and he was not ready for a mild one. Ezra Bell rode up on a Thursday morning in late September, his wagon bed empty because he had delivered the last of his contracted lumber to a ranch outfit 20 miles south. Bell was 56 years old, a former Army wagon master who had survived 2 winters at Fort Rice and 1 at Fort Sully by keeping supply lines open through conditions that killed men who wandered 50 yards from a fire. He had built more cabins than any man in the settlement and buried more neighbors than he cared to count. When Ezra Bell walked a property, people listened because Bell did not offer opinions. He offered measurements. and the measurements were always right. He tied his horse to Martin's fence rail, which was not a fence rail, but a cottonwood pole leaned between two rocks, and he walked the cabin without being invited. Martin led him. There was no point in pretending the place was sound. Bell pressed his palm flat against the north wall and held it there for a 10 count. He pulled his hand away and looked at it as though the wall had told him something the wood would rather have kept quiet. He crouched at the footing where the bottom log met the stone foundation and pushed his fingers into the gap. Daylight came through from the other side. He stood and walked to the northwest corner where two logs crossed, and he put his ear to the joint. The wind was audible, a thin, steady whistle that sounded like a man breathing through his teeth. He checked the door frame next. The leather hinges had stretched enough to leave a gap at the top wide as 2 fingers. The sill was rough cut and sitting on uneven stone. Light showed underneath. Bell knelt and put his hand at the gap and felt the draft pull across his knuckles like a slow, cold river. Then he walked to the woodpile and counted. He did not estimate. He counted each cord row, each stack, each split. It took him less than a minute. "How many cords you figure you have?" Bell said. "1.5, maybe closer to 2 if I split what is left in the stand." Bell shook his head once, the way a man shakes his head when the number confirms what he already feared. "You need 6 cords stacked and dry. 8 if the drifts pin you in and you cannot reach an outer pile. You have got maybe 1.5 of soft cottonwood that will burn hot and fast and leave you nothing by January." He wiped his hands on his coat. "And that shell leaks like a sieve, Martin. I can feel the draw from 6 feet away. Every joint on your north face is open. Your corner work is rough. I can hear the wind through the crossings from outside. Your footing has got a gap I could slide a knife through. Your door might as well be a curtain." Martin said nothing because there was nothing to argue. "I built a cabin for Emery Walsh in '78, Bell continued, his voice carrying the weight of a man who teaches through failure. "Emery had good logs, tight corners, proper chinking, 5 cords of oak stacked dry, and he still burned through it all by the 2nd week of March because the wind that year ran steady for 19 days and he could not keep the heat inside. He made it. Barely. And his cabin was twice the structure yours is." Bell looked at the rise where Sarah's grave sat under its cairn of river stones. He did not mention it. He did not need to. The calculation was visible in the silence between the two men. Martin could not cut 6 cords of wood before freeze-up and also repair the cabin. He could not repair the cabin and also cut 6 cords. He could not do both because he was one man with 1 lame-prone mule and 1 pair of hands, and autumn was already running out from under him like water through a cracked barrel. "If you need to sell the claim," Bell said quietly, "do it before the snow. You will get a better price now than in January when everyone knows you are desperate." He climbed back onto his wagon, clicked his tongue at his horse, and left. Martin stood in the yard and looked at the cabin. He looked at the woodpile. He looked at the sky, which was the color of old iron and moving fast from the northwest. Eliza watched him from the doorway. She had Sarah's eyes and Sarah's way of standing very still when she was frightened, her hands pressed flat against the door frame as though holding herself in place. "We are not selling," Martin said. He was not sure if he was talking to his daughter or to the wind or to the woman buried on the hill. The idea did not arrive as an idea. It arrived as a memory, and the memory arrived because of the wind. 3 days after Bell's visit, Martin woke before dawn to feed the stove. The night had been the coldest yet. Not true winter cold, not the killing cold that would come in December and January, but the kind of October chill that reminds a man what is coming and asks him what he plans to do about it. He loaded 2 splits of cottonwood and crouched beside the stove and waited for the iron to warm. The fire caught. The stove ticked as it expanded. Heat began moving into the room. Martin put his hand against the inside of the north wall. The logs were cold. Not cool. Cold. The kind of cold that meant the wall was not holding anything. The heat from the stove was moving through the air inside the cabin, touching the wall and dying there. He could feel the draft pulling across the back of his hand, a steady invisible current that ran from the gaps in the chinking, down across the floor where Eliza slept on a straw tick, and up through the space where the roof met the wall plate. The cabin was not a shelter. It was a funnel. The stove heated the air. The air touched the walls. The walls gave the heat to the wind. The wind carried it away across the empty prairie where no one needed it. The stove was working. The cabin was giving the heat away faster than the stove could make it. Martin pulled his hand back and stood still for a long time. The fire popped. Eliza shifted under her blanket. Outside, the wind ran steady against the north face. Then the memory came. His father, Clement Hale, had been a charcoal burner in the mountains of western North Carolina. He built kilns out of stacked earth and packed clay, fired them for days at temperatures that would char green timber to the core, and in winter he worked in a shed behind the house that had walls of packed clay 18 inches thick. That shed stayed warm long after the fire in its small stove had gone to coals. Martin was 9 or 10 years old the winter his father took him outside on a January morning, frost on the dead leaves, breath hanging white, and pressed the boy's palm flat against the clay wall of the shed. It was warm, not hot. Warm the way a living thing is warm, the way a horse's flank is warm when you press your cheek against it. Then his father walked him 30 yards to the barn. The barn was board-sided, built tight by local standards, but gapped at every seam where the boards had shrunk. It had a stove in it for the animals, the same wood, the same fire. His father pressed the boy's palm against the barn wall. Cold. Knife cold. The boards might as well have been iron standing in the frost. "Feel that," his father said. His voice was quiet, the way he always spoke when he was teaching. "That barn has a stove in it, same as the shed. Same fuel, same fire. The difference is the wall. Clay holds heat. Boards let it go. And wind." He pointed at the gap where two barn boards did not quite meet. Martin could hear the whistle. "Wind does not steal heat slow, boy. Wind is a thief that runs. It takes everything if you give it a seam to work with." Martin remembered his father crouching beside the shed wall and smearing wet clay into a hairline crack with his bare hands. The soot on his knuckles mixed with the gray mud. The draft stopped. The wall warmed under the boy's palm. It was not complicated. It was not theory. It was physics that a child could understand through skin. Now Martin Hale stood in his leaking Dakota cabin 20 years later and thought about that wall. And for the first time since Sarah died, the impossible math shifted in his mind. Not by much, but enough. He walked to the river the next morning before full light. The cut bank below his claim exposed a seam of blue-gray subsoil clay, dense, sticky, heavy when wet, the kind that river bluffs hold in layers above the waterline. He had noticed it before and thought nothing of it. Clay was dirt. Dirt was what you walked on, what caked on your boots, what turned the yard to soup when it rained. But his father had built with it. His father had packed it into walls and burned charcoal inside those walls and kept heat trapped in a space that should have been cold. Martin dug a fistful and squeezed. It held its shape. He rolled it between his palms and felt the density, far heavier than topsoil, finer than sand, with a slick texture that meant it would pack tight against itself and shed water once it cured hard. He carried a full bucket of it back up the slope to the cabin and pressed a handful into the worst joint on the north wall, the crossing where two logs met at the corner and daylight showed through the gap. The draft stopped, not diminished, stopped. One handful of clay, and the whistle that had been bleeding heat through that corner since the cabin was built went silent. He pressed his hand against the clay an hour later. It was already firming. After a day, it was hard enough to resist his thumbnail. The gap that had been surrendering heat to the wind was sealed, and the log surface beside it was measurably less cold to the touch. Martin looked at the bucket. He looked at the wall. He looked at the river, where the clay seam stretched 40 feet along the cut bank. The idea was not insulation. He did not have that word, and he did not need it. The idea was frontier logic stripped to its bones. If he could not cut enough wood to outrun the wind, he could change the wall so the wind had nothing to steal. Seal every joint. Add mass to every surface. Make the cabin hold heat the way his father's clay shed had held heat, not by burning more fuel, but by losing less. But sealing joints was only the beginning of what was building in Martin's mind. If clay could close a gap, it could coat a wall. If it could coat a wall, it could thicken a wall. If the wall was thick enough, dense enough, continuous enough, the cabin would stop behaving like a log structure with seams and start behaving like something closer to an earthen dwelling. He had seen sod houses on the plains, squat, ugly, dark inside, and warm. The settlers who lived in them complained about dirt falling from the ceiling and insects in the walls, but they did not complain about cold. Sod held heat because sod had mass. Clay had mass. And if he rounded the corners, built the clay out in smooth curves instead of leaving the sharp right angles where logs crossed and wind caught and pried, the gale would slide around the shape instead of biting into the edges. He could not build a new house. He did not have the time or the timber or the hands, but he could change the house he had. He could bury it in clay so thick that the wind would find nothing to grab and the cold would find nothing to penetrate. The cabin would not look like a cabin anymore. It would look like a mound, a boulder, a thing that belonged to the ground. It would look insane, and Martin did not care what it looked like because the alternative was watching his daughter freeze. Nels Torvik came by 2 days later. Torvik was 34, a neighboring homesteader out of Minnesota who had survived one Dakota winter already and considered himself experienced on that basis alone. He was not a bad man. He was a practical man, and practical men distrusted what they had not seen work. He had a wife, 2 young sons, and 4 cords of elm stacked in a shed he had built with proper joints. He believed in conventional preparation because conventional preparation had kept his family alive the year before. Martin was mixing clay in a trench he had dug beside the cabin. He had added chopped prairie grass and a handful of dried goat manure, working the material with his boots the way he had watched his father knead kiln mud years ago. The mix was heavy and gray-blue, and it smelled like river bottom and something organic and old. Torvik watched from horseback for a full minute before he dismounted. "What are you doing to your cabin, Hale?" "Sealing it. With mud. With clay. River clay from the cut bank, mixed with grass for binding." Torvik walked closer and touched the wet surface Martin had pressed onto the lower section of the north wall. His finger sank in half an inch and left a track. He pulled his hand back and rubbed the clay between his thumb and forefinger, studying it like a man appraising a purchase he already knew he would not make. "Mud cracks," Torvik said flatly. "First hard freeze, the water in it expands, and the surface splits. Then the first thaw, moisture gets into those cracks, freezes again the next night, and the whole mess breaks apart and slides off your wall in sheets. I have seen mud chinking fail on cabins built twice as well as yours. You are putting weight on walls that are already questionable, and you are doing it with material that will not survive the first real freeze-thaw cycle. My father built kilns out of this kind of clay. They held for years. Your father was not building on the open Dakota prairie, in the teeth of a winter that Ezra Bell says could be the worst in a decade. This is not a mountain hollow in North Carolina, Martin. The wind here does not play. It hits flat and it hits steady, 40 miles an hour for days at a time, and it will peel that mud off your walls like bark off a dead cottonwood. Then I will put it back on. With what hands? When you are burning your last half cord and the snow is chest deep, and you cannot reach the river because the trail is drifted shut. You're betting your autumn on a material that every man in this settlement knows fails. Torvik pointed at the woodpile. You should be cutting wood, right now, today. Every hour you spend hauling mud from the river is an hour you're not adding to that stack. And that stack is what will keep your daughter alive, not mud. Martin looked at the woodpile. 1.5 cords, maybe 2 if he counted the green cottonwood that would smoke more than heat and spit sparks through the cracked flue collar. If I cut wood for 6 weeks straight, Martin said, I might get to 4 cords, might, and the cabin still leaks through every joint. 4 cords in a leaking cabin gets me to February. Maybe. If I coat the walls thick enough that the heat stays in, 4 cords could last all winter. The math only works one way, Nels. Torvik shook his head. The math works the way the mud works, and mud does not work. He mounted his horse, paused as though he wanted to say something else, and then rode north without looking back. Martin went back to the trench and kept mixing. His hands were already raw from the clay. The risk was real, and Martin knew it with the clarity that only a man responsible for a child can know risk. He was gambling the autumn. Every day he spent hauling clay from the cut bank was a day he was not felling cottonwood. If the clay shell cracked, slumped, or washed away in the first hard rain, he would enter winter with a failed experiment and a woodpile that could not carry him past the new year. Eliza would pay for the gamble. That thought sat in his chest like a swallowed stone every morning when he woke and every night when he lay on his pallet and listened to the wind test the walls. But the other path led nowhere either. Bell's math was clear, 6 cords minimum, and Martin could not cut 6 cords before freeze-up. Not alone. Not with one aging mule and 30 miles of open grass between him and the nearest timber stand worth the trip. The conventional answer was not available to him. It had never been available. Every man in the settlement who told him to cut more wood was telling him to do something that could not be done in the time he had left. The only variable Martin could change was the wall. Jonas Cray found out about the mud 2 days after Torvik's visit, and Jonas did not ride out to see it for himself. He did not need to. Jonas Cray was 42 years old, the settlement storekeeper, its informal banker, and its most reliable buyer of distressed claims, abandoned tools, and livestock sold cheap by men who had decided that the frontier had beaten them. He ran a ledger with every homesteader's debts recorded in a tight hand, and he had a memory for who owed what and when they would break. When a homesteader failed, Jonas profited. He bought claims low and waited for values to rise. He purchased tools at desperation prices and resold them at full markup to the next wave of hopefuls. He was not evil in the way of storybook villains. He was patient in the way of a man who understood that the frontier sorted people into those who held on and those who let go, and that there was money in the moment of letting go. Martin Hale's claim sat on good ground near water with a file deed and a half-finished cabin. If Hale failed, and Jonas calculated that he would, the claim could be acquired for the cost of back taxes and a mule nobody else wanted. So when Nels Torvik mentioned the mud project at the store, Jonas listened. He listened the way he always listened, leaning on the counter with his ledger open, making small marks with a pencil that could have meant anything. And then he did what Jonas Cray did best. He repeated it. You hear what Hale is doing to that cabin of his? Jonas said to 3 men buying salt and coffee at the counter. His voice was easy, almost amused, the tone of a man sharing something remarkable. He is coating it in river mud. I mean thick, layer after layer, mixing it with grass and God knows what else and plastering it on like he is building a kiln instead of a house. Got his hands in the clay up to his elbows and his daughter standing beside him, stirring the mix like she is making biscuit dough. From the road, the place does not even look like a cabin anymore. It looks like somebody dropped a boulder on a stovepipe. One of the men laughed outright. Another, a freighter named Doss, said nothing but shifted on his feet. The third said, "Man has got a right to try." "A man has got a right to fail, too," Jonas said. He let that land for a moment before he continued. "And when he does fail, that 12-year-old girl of his is going to need somewhere warm to go. I hope he has thought about that, because I'm not sure mud is going to keep a child alive in January." The phrase traveled the way all phrases travel in small settlements, by repetition, by variation, by the slow accumulation of telling and retelling until the original words no longer matter and only the judgment remains. Within a week, Martin's place had a name: Mudrock. Children said it on the road. Teamsters said it passing through. Women buying flour at Cray's counter said it the way people say the name of someone they pity, which was worse than open laughter, because laughter fades but pity lingers, and pity turns into distance. Martin felt the distance tighten around him like a rope. A man named Birch, who had traded labor with Martin in August, a day of fence work in exchange for a day of hauling, did not come when Martin sent word asking for help with a fallen cottonwood blocking the river trail. No reply, no excuse, just silence. A woman named Clara Voss, who had brought a pot of stew and a loaf of bread after Sarah's funeral, stopped coming by. She was not unkind. She simply could not afford to be associated with a man the settlement had decided was a fool, because a woman alone in a community that's small survived by consensus, and consensus had moved against Martin Hale. Ezra Bell, who had at least been direct and honest in his doubt, now simply avoided the place. He had delivered his verdict. He had told Martin the math. What Martin did with that information was Martin's business, and Bell wanted no part of the mud. Only Eliza stayed. She carried water from the river in a wooden bucket that weighed nearly as much as she did when full. She stirred the clay trench with a cottonwood stick when Martin's arms cramped. She hauled grass from the near meadow in armloads that left her forearms scratched and stinging. She did not say the method would work. She did not say anything about the method at all. She simply worked beside her father in the silence that had settled over her since her mother's death, and that silence was the loudest vote of confidence Martin Hale had. He could not afford to stop. Stopping now meant returning to Bell's math. 1.5 cords, a leaking cabin, and a winter that every sign and every old man's silence said would be without mercy. So he kept hauling clay. The real construction began on the first day of October, and it began with failure. Martin had spent the last days of September cutting willow stakes from the brush along the river and weaving rough wattle panels, a lattice of thin branches lashed with cord and pegged to the cabin's exterior walls. The wattle gave the clay something to grip. Without it, the weight of a thick coat would sag on the round surface of the logs and slide off before it could cure. He had learned this the hard way 4 days earlier, when a section of wet clay 2 inches thick on the bare north wall, a full day's labor, 9 buckets hauled from the river, had slumped into a shapeless pile at the footing overnight. One cool night, and the clay had simply let go of the wood and fallen. He stood looking at the pile the next morning and felt something close to panic. If the clay would not stay on the wall, the plan was dead. Then he thought about how his father's kiln walls were built, not clay pressed against smooth surfaces, but clay packed into frameworks of stacked wood and woven branches. The clay needed structure. It needed something inside it to hold on to. Martin cut willow for 2 days straight, working until his hands blistered, and the blisters broke, and new blisters formed on top of the raw skin. The wattle changed everything. He drove sharpened stakes into the ground at the base of the wall and wove thinner branches horizontally between them, creating a rough lattice that stood 2 to 3 inches off the log surface. When he pressed clay into the lattice, it locked. The weave held the weight. The clay gripped the branches and cured in place instead of sliding. The first proper coat went on wet and heavy. Martin mixed the clay in the trench beside the cabin, 3 parts blue-gray river clay, to 1 part chopped prairie grass to a fistful of dried goat manure for binding, all worked with his boots until the consistency was thick enough to hold a thumbprint, but wet enough to press into the weave without crumbling. He carried it in buckets. Each bucket weighed close to 40 pounds when full. The north wall alone took 11 buckets for the first coat, and the first coat was only the start. His hands cracked by the 3rd day. The alkaline clay stripped the oil from his skin. The constant gripping of shovel handles and bucket rims opened splits at every knuckle that bled when he flexed his fingers in the morning cold. He wrapped his palms in strips of cloth torn from an old shirt of Sarah's, and by evening the cloth was stiff with dried clay and spotted brown with blood. His back seized on the 5th day a knotted muscle below the left shoulder blade that made lifting the bucket above waist height an act of gritted will. He worked through it because the calendar did not care about his back. October was burning. Every day of sun and above freezing temperature was a day the clay could cure. Every day lost was a section of wall that would face winter uncoated. Eliza helped. She could not lift the full buckets, but she could carry half loads, and she could work the mix in the trench while Martin hauled from the river. Her arms were not strong enough to knead the clay with her boots the way Martin did, so she used the stick, turning the mix over and over until the grass was distributed and the lumps were broken. She worked without complaint and without conversation, her thin arms dark with clay to the elbows, her mother's patched scarf tied around her hair to keep the mud out of it. She was 12 years old, and she was doing the labor of a grown hand because there was no grown hand to do it. By the 2nd week of October, the north wall had 2 full coats cured and a 3rd going on. The surface was rough but continuous, no gaps, no joints, no place where daylight could penetrate. Martin pressed his hand against the interior face of the wall at dawn, before lighting the stove, on a morning when the air outside was cold enough to leave frost on the grass. The logs behind the clay were cool, but they were not the bone-deep, heat-stealing cold he had felt a month earlier. Something had changed. The wall was holding. That night the temperature dropped below freezing for the first time. Martin fed the stove 2 splits of cottonwood, the same amount he had been burning every night, and waited. An hour later, he put his hand on the interior wall again. Cool, but not cold. The steady draft that had run like a river along the floor from the north wall was gone. The cabin was not warm. It was still a long way from warm, but the bleeding had stopped. The heat that the stove made was staying in the room instead of leaking through the joints into the open prairie. He did not celebrate. He noted it the way a man notes a tool that works on first test, with relief and with the immediate knowledge that the test was not enough. He went to bed and set his mind on the west wall, which caught the 2nd worst wind and would take 15 buckets per coat, 3 coats minimum. Outside, the wind rose. It came from the northwest, steady and dry, carrying the smell of dead grass and distance and the taste of something metallic that meant cold air moving down from the north. The season was turning hard. Martin had coated 2 faces of the cabin. 2 faces remained. The mule had gone lame 3 days earlier on a stone bruise in the left forefoot and could not haul. Martin was carrying every bucket himself, 40 pounds at a time, up the slope from the cut bank to the cabin, a distance of 300 yards one way. His shoulders burned. His lower back had stopped hurting and gone numb, which was worse. The woodpile had not grown by a single stick since the clay work started. 1.5 cords sat against the east wall under a canvas tarp that was too small to cover the top row. Every split that got wet was a split that would smoke instead of burn. And the winter that Ezra Bell had warned about, the winter that old men watched the sky for, the winter that geese fled 3 weeks early and teamsters reported early ice, and freight drivers shook their heads. That winter was no longer a prediction. It had arrived at the edges. The first real snow would come within weeks, maybe sooner. When it did, the river clay at the cut bank would freeze solid, and Martin's supply would be locked under ice and frost until spring. Whatever he was going to build, he had to build it now. Whatever the walls would become, they had to become it before the ground closed. And whatever the settlement thought of the man who was turning his cabin into a mud-boulder, whatever Jonas Cray said at the counter, whatever name the children called the place on the road, whatever judgment traveled outward through the territory on the tongues of freight teamsters and visiting neighbors, that man had no other path remaining. The wood was not enough. The cabin was not sound. The winter was coming. The clay was the plan. The plan was the clay. And the clock was almost out of time. If you have ever been told your way of doing things was wrong by people who could not see what you were building, tell us about it in the comments. Because Martin Hale was not finished yet. And neither was the winter. The west wall was worse than the north. The logs on that face had been cut in a hurry during the first weeks on the claim, when Martin was racing to get a roof overhead before the summer rains, and the work showed. The joints were loose. 2 logs had checks, deep cracks running along the grain that let air through even where the chinking looked solid. The corner where the west wall met the north wall was the weakest point on the entire structure, a gap wide enough to see daylight through from inside, where the notch had been cut too shallow and the logs did not sit flush. Martin started on the west wall the 3rd week of October. The mule was still lame, so he carried every bucket himself. 300 yards from the cut bank to the cabin, uphill, 40 pounds per load. 11 loads for the first coat on the west face. 33 loads for 3 coats. 99 trips, give or take, for 1 wall. His shoulders knotted. The muscles in his forearms stopped hurting and started trembling, a steady, involuntary shaking that made the bucket handles rattle and the clay slop over the rims. He ate less because stopping to cook meant stopping to work, and stopping to work meant the sun moved without him. Eliza watched the trembling. She did not say anything about it. She started leaving a piece of cornbread and a cup of goat milk on the upturned bucket by the door each morning so that Martin could eat without sitting down. By the 4th day on the west wall, Martin had the first coat cured and the second coat half applied when a cold rain came in from the south. Rain was the enemy he had not planned for. The water hit the uncured clay and softened the top layer. By morning, the second coat on the lower third of the west wall had slumped. Not all of it, but enough. A section 4 feet wide and 3 feet tall had sagged off the wattle and pooled at the base, taking a full day's work with it. Martin stood in the rain looking at the damage. The gray mud ran in streams across the ground. His hands hung at his sides. Eliza came to the door and looked at the slumped wall and looked at her father and went back inside without speaking. He rebuilt the section that afternoon, working in the rain because he could not afford to wait for dry weather. The clay was harder to mix wet, harder to carry, harder to press into the wattle when his hands were slick. But it went on. It held because the wattle held it, and he learned something. The base of the wall needed protection, a gravel apron, an overhang, something that kept the runoff from cutting at the lowest layer where the weight was greatest. He did not yet know how to solve that problem, but he knew it existed, and knowing it existed was the first step toward a solution he could not yet see. August Krantz arrived on a morning in late October, the way most travelers arrived on the river road, slowly, on a tired horse, with a pack mule behind him carrying everything he owned. He was 61 years old, thin in the way of men who have worked hard their entire lives and never eaten quite enough. His face was creased and brown. His hands were enormous, wide across the palm, thick in the fingers, scarred in ways that told a story if you knew how to read them. Franz was a Volga German. His family had left the German settlements along the Volga River in Russia a generation earlier and come to the American plains, where the soil was familiar and the winters were not. He had spent his working life building with earth, clay bricks in Kansas, sod houses in Nebraska, kiln walls for a brickyard outside Yankton. He was traveling north to join a nephew's family near the Missouri, and he had stopped at the river because his horse needed water and his back needed an hour off the saddle. He watered the horse. He stretched, and then he looked up the slope at Martin Hale's cabin and went still. From the road, the cabin did not look like a cabin. The north and west walls were coated in thick gray clay, smoothed, rough, but continuous, with the corners rounded into curves that blurred the line between structure and earth. The south and east walls were still bare logs, raw and angular, and the contrast made the coated walls look even stranger, as though the building were being slowly swallowed by the ground itself. Krantz tied his horse and walked up the slope without being invited. Martin was at the trench, mixing. He looked up and saw a stranger studying his wall the way Ezra Bell had studied it a month earlier with his hands. But Krantz did not press his palm flat and pull it away in judgment. Krantz pressed his thumb into the cured surface of the north wall and held it there. He dragged his thumb sideways, testing the bond. He tapped with his knuckle. He crouched and looked at the base where the clay met the ground. He stood and ran his hand along the curve of the northwest corner, feeling the shape. Then he turned to Martin. His English was accented but clear. "Too fat," Krantz said. "The mix is too fat. Too much clay, not enough fiber. It will crack before it cures all the way through. You can see it already." He pointed at a hairline fracture running diagonally across the north wall, a crack Martin had noticed but hoped would not matter. "That will open. When it opens, the wind gets in. When the wind gets in, the wall is just weight. It is not protection." Martin felt his stomach drop. "Can it be fixed?" "It can be fixed, but not by adding more of the same. The mix needs grass, more grass than you are using. Cut it short, the length of your thumb, no longer. And manure, not a handful, a real portion, 1 part in 5. The fiber holds the clay together the way bones hold a body together. Without it, the clay is just mud. Mud cracks. Clay with fiber cures." Krantz looked at the trench where Martin had been mixing. He crouched beside it and picked up a handful of the wet clay. He squeezed it and watched it ooze between his fingers. He shook his head. "How thick are you building?" Krantz asked. 3 inches, 4 on the windward corners." "Good. That's enough for mass. But the lifts are wrong. You're putting the full thickness on wet, yes? 1 coat thick and letting it cure." 2 coats, sometimes 3. "How long between coats?" "A day, 2 if the weather's cold." Krantz stood. "That is not enough. Each lift needs to firm before the next goes on. Not cure. Firm. You press your thumb in and it resists but does not crack. 3 days minimum between coats in this weather. If you put wet clay on clay that is not firmed, the weight of the top layer pulls the bottom layer off the wattle. That is why your south section slumped." Martin stared at him. "You saw the slump." "I saw the repair. The new clay is a different color than the old, lighter, which means you mixed it wetter and pressed it on fast." Krantz's voice was not unkind. It was the voice of a man who had watched enough walls fail to recognize the shape of the failure before it finished happening. "The instinct to hurry is wrong. Speed kills earthen walls. Patience builds them." Martin looked at the sky, gray, moving, cold at the edges. "I do not have patience. I have weeks. Maybe less." "Then we work smart, not fast. I can show you. But first we fix the mix." Krantz stayed that day. He reworked the contents of the trench adding armloads of prairie grass that he cut with a borrowed sickle and chopped against a flat stone until the pieces were no longer than his thumb. He added dried goat manure, not a token handful, but a full bucket, which he broke apart and crumbled into the clay with his enormous hands. Then he and Martin worked the mix with their boots, stepping and turning, until the clay was threaded with fiber the way bread dough is threaded with gluten. The new mix felt different. It was stiffer, heavier, harder to press. But when Martin packed a test section onto the bare east wall and left it overnight, it did not slump. It did not crack. It sat on the wattle and firmed, and by the next afternoon it was hard enough that Kranz's thumbnail left only a shallow mark. "Now," Kranz said, "we build." Kranz did not stay permanently. He had family waiting and obligations north, but he came back. 3 times in the first 2 weeks of November, riding the river road from wherever he had camped, spending 2 or 3 days each time working beside Martin on the walls. He never explained why he returned. Martin never asked. Some things between working men do not require explanation. Kranz had recognized not folly in Martin's project, but unfinished skill. An unfinished skill in a man willing to learn was something Kranz could not walk past. What Kranz taught, he taught through his hands. He showed Martin how to build in lifts, thin coats, each one allowed to firm for 3 days before the next went on. The temptation was to go thick and fast. The discipline was to go thin and patient. A wall built in 4 thin lifts was stronger than a wall built in 2 thick ones, because each layer bonded to the one beneath it, and the whole mass cured as a single structure instead of separating into strata. He showed Martin how to protect the base. Gravel, packed tight against the footing, angled so that water running off the wall would hit stone and splash away from the clay instead of pooling against it. A drip edge along the roof line, made from split cottonwood boards, extended 6 inches beyond the wall face, so that rain would fall clear of the surface. A shoulder around the doorway, a thickened ridge of clay and stone that diverted water away from the opening where traffic and use would wear the surface thin. He showed Martin how to read a crack. A hairline crack running vertically meant the wall was drying too fast. Shade it, slow the cure. A crack running horizontally meant the layers were separating. The lift beneath was not firm enough when the next went on. A crack running diagonally meant the mix was too fat, not enough fiber. Every crack told you what was wrong if you knew the language. Martin listened. He watched. He copied. And then he began to understand, which was different from copying and more important. He began to feel the clay the way Kranz felt it, knowing by the resistance under his thumb whether a lift was ready, knowing by the color of the surface whether the mix was right, knowing by the sound of his knuckle tap whether the wall had cured solid or was still soft at the core. In the evenings, Kranz sat by Martin's stove and ate whatever Eliza cooked, beans, cornbread, goat milk, and told pieces of his life. The brick kilns in Kansas, where he had learned to fire clay until it rang like iron. The sod house in Nebraska, where his wife had died of consumption, in a room that stayed warm all winter but smelled of earth and grief. The nephew who had written asking him to come north, promising land and family and a place to rest. Kranz was tired. Martin could see it in the way the older man moved at the end of each day, slower, stiffer, his enormous hands curling into themselves as though they were remembering all the walls they had built. But in the mornings, Kranz worked. He worked with the steady, unhurried rhythm of a man who had been lifting and pressing and shaping for 50 years and would continue until his body refused. And Martin worked beside him, matching the rhythm, learning the pace that was not slow and not fast, but right. November ground forward. The south wall went on in 3 lifts over 9 days. The east wall, which was the most sheltered face, went on in 2 lifts over 6. Martin rounded every corner, building the clay out in smooth curves that Kranz approved with a nod and a tap. The northwest corner, which caught the worst of the prevailing wind, got an extra lift. 4 inches of tempered clay curved into a shape that would make the gale slide around instead of catching the edge. The cabin was disappearing. Where there had been a log structure with sharp angles and visible joints, there was now a gray, rounded mass. The roof ridge still showed, and the stovepipe stuck up from the center, and the door was a dark rectangle cut into the smooth face of the south wall. But from a distance from the road, from the ridge above, the cabin looked like a boulder, a smooth gray stone that had always been there, settled into the grass, belonging to the ground. Martin narrowed the window opening on the east wall to a slit barely wide enough to pass a hand through. Fitted with a wooden shutter he could seal tight from inside. He rebuilt the door frame with the heavier boards Krantz helped him split, and he packed the gaps with clay and gravel until no light showed at any edge. He left one controlled smoke vent at the roof peak, angled so that wind could not drive directly down it, and fitted it with a flat stone cap that could be adjusted for draw. Ezra Bell came by in the second week of November. He had not visited since September. He rode up, stopped his horse, and sat in the saddle looking at the cabin for a long time without dismounting. "Well," Bell said, "it does not look like a cabin." "No," Martin said. He was smoothing a section of the east wall with the flat back of his shovel. "It looks like you buried one." "I did." Bell dismounted and walked the perimeter. He did not touch the walls. He looked at the base, where the gravel apron directed water away. He looked at the roof line, where the drip edge extended past the wall face. He looked at the rounded corners and the sealed joints and the narrowed window and the reinforced door frame. "How much wood have you got?" Bell said. 2 cords, maybe a bit more. I cut some when the mule came sound again." 2 cords. Bell turned and looked at the structure again. His face was unreadable. "That is not enough. Not for a normal cabin." "This is not a normal cabin." Bell said nothing for a long moment. Then he reached out and put his palm flat on the south wall, which was cured and hard and warm where the afternoon sun hit it. He held his hand there the way he had held it on the bare logs in September. Martin watched him feel the difference. "It may be less drafty," Bell said carefully, "but one true Dakota gale, and I mean a real one, 30 miles an hour steady for 3 days, will test every inch of that shell. Wind finds weakness, Martin. If there is one seam, one crack, one soft spot, the wind will find it, and it will work it open, and everything you built will fail from that one point." "Then there had better not be one seam." Bell mounted his horse. "I hope you are right, for that girl's sake." He rode away. Martin went back to the wall and kept smoothing. By the last week of November, the cabin was finished. The word felt strange in Martin's mind because the structure did not look finished. It looked like something that had grown out of the earth, or something that the earth had reclaimed. A smooth gray mound with a stovepipe and a door and a slit window sitting on the rise above the river with snow beginning to collect in the grass around it. Martin recorded performance the only way a man on the frontier could, by feel and by fuel. The stove burned 2 splits of cottonwood per night to keep the cabin livable. Before the clay, it had burned 3, sometimes 4, and the cabin had still been cold by morning. Now 2 splits held through the night, and the interior was not warm. Martin had stopped expecting warm, but it was bearable. Eliza slept without her coat for the first time since October. The frost that had formed on the interior walls every morning was gone from the coated faces. It still appeared on the section of roof boards that Martin had not been able to coat, a reminder that the shell was imperfect. But the walls held. The arithmetic had shifted. 2 cords of wood at 2 splits per night meant roughly 60 days of fuel. That carried them to the end of January. If Martin could cut even a small amount more before deep winter locked everything down, he might stretch to February. If the shell performed better than his cautious estimate, he might stretch further. It was not comfortable math, but it was survivable math, and a month ago it had been impossible math. Nels Torvik rode by and looked at the cabin without stopping. He slowed his horse, studied the shape, and rode on. The next day he told his wife that Hale's place looked like a molehill with a chimney, but he said it quietly, and he did not say it at the store. Jonas Cray was not quiet. Jonas told everyone who came through the door that Martin Hale had sealed himself inside a dirt tomb, and that when the first real blow came, the mud would crack off, and the man would freeze with his daughter beside him, and the claim would be available by spring. He said it like he was predicting weather, matter of fact, certain, already planning. August Krantz rode down from the north one final time in late November. He walked the finished shell slowly, tapping every surface, checking every seam, pressing his thumb into every corner. He found 2 hairline cracks on the west wall and showed Martin how to fill them with a thin slurry of clay and fine sand that penetrated the fracture and bonded to both faces. He checked the drip edge and the gravel apron and the door frame seal. Then he stood back and looked at the whole structure and said the thing Martin needed to hear and feared hearing in equal measure. "The house is ready," Krantz said, "but this winter will test it. Not the cold. The cold is simple. Mass defeats cold. What I worry about is weeks of wind, steady wind, the kind that does not stop. Wind dries the surface. Wind finds the smallest opening and works it wider. Wind is patient. Your wall must be more patient." "And if it is not?" Krantz looked at him with the steady gaze of a man who had outlived most of the things he had built. "Then you will know before January." He shook Martin's hand. His grip was still enormous, still strong, but Martin felt the tremor in it now, a fine vibration in the bones that had not been there in October. Krantz mounted his horse slowly, favoring his left hip, and rode north into the gray sky. Martin watched him go until the road bent and the horse and rider disappeared behind the ridge. The cabin sat on the rise, gray and smooth and silent, smoke lifting from the vent in a thin straight line. The woodpile sat under its tarp, 2 cords. The sky pressed down. The wind was steady from the northwest, 10 miles an hour, cold, but not yet cruel. The storm had not come yet, but Martin could feel it building in the air the way a man feels a hand drawing back before the blow lands. December opened with 3 days of clear, bitter cold. The temperature dropped below 0 at night and did not climb above 10 during the day. Martin used the days to haul what firewood he could reach, cutting dead-standing cottonwood along the river and dragging it back with the mule, splitting it against the east wall where the snow had not yet drifted. He added perhaps a 1/4 cord. It was not much, but every stick was another night. Then the storms began. The first one came on the 7th of December out of the northwest, the way Dakota storms always came, announced by a dropping sky and a silence that swallowed the wind for 2 hours before the wind came back tenfold. The temperature fell 20 degrees in 4 hours. Snow drove horizontal across the open ground, so thick that Martin could not see the river from the cabin door. He sealed the door. He sealed the window shutter. He checked the vent cap and adjusted it for the wind direction. Then he sat by the stove with Eliza and listened. The wind hit the north wall with a sound like a hand slapping a drum, a low, continuous thud that vibrated through the clay and into the logs beneath. Martin put his hand on the interior wall. It vibrated, but it did not flex. It did not give. The clay was taking the blow and spreading it across the entire surface instead of letting it concentrate at the joints the way bare logs would. The corners, the rounded built-out corners that Krantz had approved, deflected the gale. Martin could hear the difference. At the sharp corner of the stovepipe housing, the wind screamed. At the rounded corners of the wall, the wind moaned and slid past. The storm lasted 2 days. When it broke, Martin opened the door and stepped outside into a world of white and silence. The snow had drifted against the north wall in a smooth, even slope that climbed nearly to the roof line. Against Bell's cabin, a mile east, the drifts had stacked sharp and jagged against the flat walls, packing into the corner joints, pressing against the door. Against Torvik's place, the snow had driven through a gap in the shed wall and buried half the firewood under wet, heavy white. Martin's walls were intact, every inch. No cracks, no slumping, no seams opened by the wind. The clay had held. But it was only December. The worst was months away. The storms stacked. One came the week before Christmas, another on the 28th, a third in the first week of January. Each one drove harder than the last. Drifts built on drifts. The road to the settlement vanished under white and did not reappear between storms. Freight stopped moving. The supply line that connected the scattered homesteads to the wider territory was buried. Fuel became the currency of survival. Families who had stacked 4 cords in September were burning through them faster than they had planned because the cold was deeper and longer than anyone had predicted. Nels Torvik, who had 4 cords of good elm, began rationing in January, dropping to 1 fire building per day instead of keeping the stove burning continuously. His wife and son slept in their coats. His youngest developed a cough that did not go away. Martin burned 2 splits per night. The cabin held its heat. The walls, now frozen on the outside and firm on the inside, behaved like a mass of earth, slow to warm, slow to cool, steady. The interior never reached warm, but it stayed above freezing. The goats, penned in a lean-to that Martin had partially coated with clay on the windward side, survived on dried grass and stubbornness. The mule stood in the lee of the cabin and endured. Then, in the 3rd week of January, the worst storm of the winter arrived. It came not as a single blow, but as a sequence. 3 days of hard wind followed by a single day of deceptive calm, followed by the true storm, which came down from the north like something that had been waiting for the calm to lull people into opening their doors. The wind hit 50 miles an hour and stayed there. The temperature dropped to 22 degrees below zero. The snow was not falling, it was flying, horizontal, driven with such force that it scoured the surface of the clay walls and left a fine white powder embedded in the frozen exterior. The sound was unlike anything Martin had heard in his life. It was not wind. It was a pressure, a physical force that pushed against the walls and the door and the roof and did not let up. Inside, Martin fed the stove, 2 splits, the usual amount. The walls vibrated, but held. The temperature inside the cabin was cold. Martin guessed it was somewhere above freezing, maybe 35 degrees, but it was survivable. The clay mass was doing its work. Heat from the stove entered the wall and stayed there, radiating slowly back through the night while the wind screamed outside and the world disappeared. Then Eliza spiked a fever. It started with the cough she had been carrying for 2 weeks, a dry, persistent rasp that Martin had been treating with honey dissolved in warm goat milk. On the 2nd night of the storm, the cough deepened. By morning, Eliza was hot to the touch. Her forehead burned under Martin's hand. Her eyes were bright and unfocused. She shivered under 2 blankets and Sarah's patched quilt, and the shivering did not stop even when Martin built the fire larger than he had allowed himself all winter, 3 splits instead of 2, then 4. The cabin warmed. The extra wood burned fast. Martin watched his fuel supply shrink and watched his daughter's breathing grow shallow and rapid, and calculated the math that no parent should ever have to calculate. How many splits to keep the cabin warm enough for a sick child, how many days of fuel remained at that rate, and how many days the storm would last. He could ride for help. The settlement was 4 miles east. There might be someone there with medicine, with knowledge, with a wagon that could carry a sick girl to wherever help existed. But the storm was a wall of white and wind outside the door. He could not see 10 feet. The horse would founder in the drifts. The trail was buried. If he left and got lost, and men got lost in storms like this, men who knew the country, men who had ridden the same trails for years, Eliza would be alone in the cabin with a fire that would die when the wood ran out. If you are invested in this story, hit subscribe now, because what happens next in that cabin, in the middle of the worst night of the worst winter Martin Hale has ever seen, changes everything. He stayed. He applied everything August Krantz had taught him. Keep the fire small but constant. Do not waste fuel on heat that will leave through the vent. Adjust the cap to restrict the draw. Let the coals build. Let the mass of the walls absorb the warmth and radiate it back. Do not open the door. Not for water, not for wood from the outer pile, not for air. The cabin was sealed. The air inside was stale and thick with smoke, but it was above freezing. Every time the door opened, minutes of accumulated heat would vanish into the storm. Martin fed the stove one split at a time. He adjusted the vent cap with a stick, narrowing the opening until the draw was just enough to keep the fire alive without pulling warm air out of the cabin. He banked the coals with ash so they would burn slow and long. He wet a cloth with water from the bucket that had not frozen because the cabin was warm enough to keep water liquid, which was itself a kind of proof, and pressed it to Eliza's forehead. She burned through the night. The storm burned outside. The fire burned in the stove. And the walls held. At some point in the deepest hours, Martin did not know the time. Time had stopped meaning anything except the interval between feeding the stove Zao. He heard a sound from the east. Faint. Almost lost under the wind. It was a crash. The sound of wood breaking under weight. He did not know what it was until 3 days later when the storm broke and he learned that the Sutton family's board shanty, a mile and a half east, had partially collapsed when a drift on the roof broke through the ridge beam. The Suttons survived. The husband had braced the beam with a table, and they had huddled in the half that still stood. But a man named Olin Pratt, who lived alone in a shed-roofed cabin farther north, was found frozen in his bed. His door had been forced open by the drift, and he had not been strong enough to close it against the weight of the snow. The wind had done the rest. Martin did not know about Olin Pratt that night. He knew about Eliza. He knew about the stove. He knew about the walls. The fever peaked sometime before dawn. Eliza's breathing went fast and shallow, and her skin was so hot that the wet cloth dried on her forehead within minutes. Martin changed it again. He talked to her, not words of comfort, not promises, but the only thing he had, the sound of his voice in the dark, saying her name, saying her mother's name, telling her about the wall and the clay and the way heat stayed in a place that was built to hold it. He did not know if she could hear him. He talked because silence in that cabin would have been the most frightening sound in the world. The fire needed feeding. He had 4 splits left beside the stove. The rest of the wood was outside, under the tarp, under the drift. He could not reach it without opening the door. He fed 1 split into the coals and watched the flame catch and felt the heat push out into the room and touch the walls and stay. The walls held. The clay held. The mass of earth and fiber and river mud that every man in the settlement had called foolish absorbed the heat from that single split of cottonwood and held it, radiating it back into the room slowly, steadily, while the wind outside screamed at 50 miles an hour, and the temperature fell to 25 below, and the world outside the door was a place where nothing warm could survive. At dawn, the wind dropped, not stopped, dropped, from 50 to 20. The howl became a moan. The snow shifted from horizontal to angled. Martin put his hand on the north wall. It was cool. Not cold. Cool. The mass had held its warmth through the worst night of the worst winter. Eliza's fever broke an hour after sunrise. The change was sudden. The heat in her skin receded like a tide going out, and her breathing slowed, and the brightness left her eyes and was replaced by something that looked like exhaustion, but was actually life continuing. She looked at her father and said the first full sentence she had spoken in a day and a half. "I am thirsty." Martin gave her water from the bucket. It was not frozen. In every other cabin he knew of in the settlement, the water bucket froze solid overnight in weather like this. In Martin's cabin, in the mud-boulder, the hog wallow, the place they called Mud Rock, the water was liquid and cool and clean. He opened the door when the wind dropped below 10. The world outside was white and scoured. The snow had drifted smooth against the north wall, climbing high but pressing gently against the curve instead of packing into joints. The south face, sheltered from the worst of the wind, showed bare clay under a dusting of powder. The stovepipe was clear. The vent was clear. The structure was intact. Martin looked east. He could see Torvik's place, a mile away, where the flat-sided cabin had taken the drifts hard. The snow was piled jagged against the walls, packed into every corner and joint. Bell's place, farther out, showed a lean-to with its roof stripped, shingles torn away by the sustained wind. Farther still, in the direction of the settlement, a column of smoke rose thin and unsteady from where the Sutton place stood, half collapsed. Martin's cabin was whole. His daughter was alive. His fire had not gone out. He had wood remaining, not much, but remaining. The walls had done what he had built them to do. He stood in the doorway and looked at the clay and felt nothing triumphant. He felt tired. He felt the weight of every bucket he had carried, every crack he had filled, every night he had lain awake listening to the wind test the walls. He felt the specific gravity of having bet everything on river clay and chopped grass and the memory of his dead father's hands, and having been right. The storm was not over. The winter was not over. But the worst night had passed, and the cabin had held, and Eliza was drinking water from a bucket that had not frozen. Martin closed the door. He fed the stove one split. He sat down beside his daughter and rested his back against the warm interior wall, and for the first time since Sarah died, the silence in the cabin felt like shelter instead of absence. The storm broke on a Thursday. By Friday, the wind had dropped to nothing, and the sky opened into the kind of cold, clear blue that follows violence, bright and still and so sharp it hurt the eyes. Martin dug out the door, cleared the vent, and checked the walls. The clay was intact. A fine dusting of ice crystals had embedded in the frozen exterior surface, where the wind had driven snow against it, but beneath that skin, the shell was solid. He tapped every corner. He ran his hand along every seam. Nothing had moved. Eliza was weak but lucid. The fever had left her hollowed, her eyes too large in her thin face, her hands shaking when she held the cup, but she was breathing steady and the cough had loosened. Martin gave her broth made from dried beans and goat milk and sat her beside the stove and did not ask her to work. Then the visitors came. Ezra Bell arrived first, the way authority always arrives, on his own terms, at his own pace, expecting to find what he expected to find. He rode up on Saturday morning with his coat buttoned to the throat and his breath streaming white and stopped his horse 20 yards from the cabin. He sat in the saddle and looked at the structure the way a man looks at something he has already judged and must now reconsider. The cabin stood. That was the first thing. It stood in a landscape of damage. Bell's own lean-to had lost half its roof to the wind. The Sutton place was propped up with timbers and leaning. Torvik's shed had drifts packed into the wall joints hard enough to require a pick to clear, and Martin Hale's cabin, the mud-boulder, the hog wallow, the place the settlement called Mud Rock, sat on the rise above the river, looking exactly the way it had looked before the storm, except that the drifts around it were smooth and gentle, where the curved walls had let the snow slide instead of catching it. Bell dismounted and walked the perimeter. This time he touched the walls. He pressed his palm flat against the north face, which had taken the worst of the 50-mile-an-hour wind for 3 straight days. The clay was cold and hard and whole. He tapped the northwest corner with his knuckle and heard the solid thud of cured earth. He crouched at the base and looked at the gravel apron, which had kept the drifted snow from pressing directly against the clay footing. He stood and looked at Martin, who was splitting wood beside the east wall. Martin had wood to split. That fact alone told Bell everything he needed to know. "How much fuel did you burn?" Bell said. 2 splits a night, 3 on the worst night when Eliza was sick. Bell did the math. Martin could see him doing it, the small movement of his lips, the narrowing of his eyes. 3 weeks of storms, 2 splits a night, 42 splits, give or take, a quarter cord, maybe a third. From a starting supply of 2 cords, that left more than a cord and a half. "You have wood remaining," Bell said. It was not a question. It was a man hearing a number that contradicted everything he knew about Dakota winters. "I do." Torvik burned through 3 cords in the same period. He is cutting furniture. Martin said nothing. He set another split on the block and brought the axe down. Bell watched the wood fall apart and stood there for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. Then he said the thing that mattered. "I was counting cords." His voice was quiet, not embarrassed, not apologetic, just honest, in the way that a man who has been right his entire life sounds when he discovers he was measuring the wrong thing. "I was counting how much wood you had and telling you it was not enough. And I was right. It was not enough. For a normal cabin, 2 cords would have killed you. But I was counting cords. You were counting what the wind could steal." Martin stopped the axe. He looked at Bell. The older man's face was still and serious and showed no trace of the dismissal that had been there in September. "The wind is where the heat goes," Martin said. "My father taught me that." Bell nodded once. "Show me the walls." Martin showed him. He walked Bell around the cabin and explained each element, not as a lecture, but as a man showing another man how a thing was built. The wattle lattice, the tempered mix, the lifts, the gravel apron, the drip edge, the rounded corners, the sealed door frame, the controlled vent. Bell listened with the attention of a builder, asking questions that revealed he was already thinking about application. How thick on the windward side? How long between lifts? What ratio of grass to clay? Whether the technique would work on a larger structure. "It would work on anything with walls," Martin said. "The principle is the same. Stop the wind from finding a seam. Give the wall enough mass to hold the heat. Let the shape turn the gale instead of catching it." Bell left without promising anything, but he left knowing things he had not known when he arrived, and Martin could see the knowledge working in the older man's face, the slow rearrangement of a lifetime of assumptions about what kept a house warm. Nels Torvik came 2 days later. He did not ride by this time. He dismounted, tied his horse, and walked to the cabin with his hands in his pockets and his shoulders high around his ears, in the posture of a man who does not want to be there but needs something too badly to stay away. His family was cold. His 4 cords of good elm were nearly gone. His wife had started burning twisted grass in the stove to stretch the wood supply, and the grass burned fast and smoky and gave almost nothing back. His youngest son's cough had settled into his chest and would not leave. The cabin that Torvik had built with proper joints and conventional chinking was bleeding heat through every seam, and the wind that found those seams was patient and relentless and would not stop until spring. Torvik did not apologize for what he had said in October. He did not need to. His presence was the apology. A man who rides to another man's claim in the dead of winter to ask for help has already said everything that matters. "How thick is your north wall?" Torvik said. 4 inches of clay over the wattle, 3 coats. "And the mix? You said grass and manure." 1 part grass cut to thumb length, 1 part manure dried and crumbled, 3 parts river clay from the cut bank, mixed wet and worked until the fiber runs through it. Torvik crouched and put his hand on the south wall, which was warm where the low winter sun hit it. He held his hand there and felt the warmth stored in the clay, the warmth that would radiate into the cabin after the sun set and continue radiating through the night. His face changed. "I called it mud," Torvik said. "It is mud. Mud that works." Torvik pulled his hand off the wall slowly, the way a man pulls his hand off something he does not trust himself to believe. "How long before it works?" Torvik said. "If I start today." "You cannot start today. The river clay is frozen at the cut bank. But you can cut willow for the wattle and stockpile grass. When the next thaw softens the bank enough to dig, you start mixing. 2 coats on your north wall, 2 on your west, 3 days between lifts. You can coat both faces in 10 days if the weather gives you windows. I do not have 10 days of mild weather between now and spring. You do not need 10 consecutive days. You need 10 days total. The clay firms between storms. You work the windows and you wait. Patience builds earthen walls. Speed kills them." Martin heard Kranz's words coming out of his own mouth and felt the strange weight of teaching something he had been taught only months ago. Torvik stayed for 2 hours. Martin walked him to the cut bank and showed him the clay seam, where to dig, how deep, how to test the clay by squeezing a fistful and watching whether it held its shape. He showed him how to cut the prairie grass and chop it against a flat stone. He showed him the wattle weave, willow stakes driven in at the base, thinner branches woven horizontal, the lattice standing 2 inches off the log surface so the clay had structure to grip. He showed him the gravel apron at the base and explained the drip edge and the sealed door frame. He did not charge for the information. He did not trade. He gave it freely because a man with a sick child and a cold cabin did not need to negotiate. He needed to know what Martin knew, and Martin needed to tell him. Torvik mounted his horse and paused. "Hail," he said. He did not finish the sentence. He nodded once and rode home. He started cutting willow that afternoon. Within a week, 3 more families sent someone to Martin's cabin to ask questions. A woman named Ada Birch, whose husband had been one of the men who refused Martin's labor request in October, came alone on foot through the snow, carrying a jar of preserved plums as payment for knowledge that Martin would have given for nothing. A young man named Wiley Stiles, who had filed a claim in November and built a shanty that was already failing, rode 12 miles to see the walls and left with notes scratched on the back of a feed receipt. A Bohemian family named Cerny, who spoke little English but understood cold and clay and mass, came with their eldest daughter translating and spent an entire day watching Martin work. Martin showed everyone the same things: the cut bank, the mix, the wattle, the lifts, the apron, the corners. He repeated himself because each family needed to hear it fresh, needed to put their own hands on the wall, needed to feel the warmth through the clay the way Martin had felt it through his father's kiln wall 30 years ago. The teaching was physical. It was not enough to explain. Each person had to press their palm flat and hold it there long enough to feel the difference between clay and board, between mass and membrane, between a wall that held heat and a wall that gave it away. The results came back within weeks. Torvik sealed his north and west walls, not a full shell, but enough to close the worst joints and add 2 inches of tempered clay over the wattle. His fuel consumption dropped. His wife stopped burning grass. His son's cough improved when the cabin held steady warmth through the night instead of cycling between fire heat and wind cold. The Stiles boy coated his entire shanty in clay, so thick it doubled the wall width. It was crude work. His mix was too wet, and his corners were not rounded. But the shanty stopped leaking, and the young man stopped shivering, and that was enough. Jonas Cray heard all of it. He heard it the way a man hears a verdict he did not expect, standing behind his counter, pencil still, ledger open, listening to customers talk about Martin Hale's walls the way they had once talked about Martin Hale's foolishness. The tone had shifted. Where there had been mockery, there was now curiosity. Where there had been pity, there was now something closer to respect. Jonas did not speak against Martin openly anymore. He shifted tactics. He told people quietly that Hale was giving away his trick because he had nothing else to sell. That a man who shares his only advantage is a man who does not understand value. That the clay would fail in the spring thaw and everyone who copied it would be worse off than before. The words still traveled, but they traveled slower now, and they landed lighter, because the people hearing them had already felt the warmth of the wall. August Krantz returned in February. He rode in on a day of weak sun and steady cold, his horse thinner than it had been in November, his pack mule gone, sold, or traded somewhere north. Krantz himself looked diminished. The winter had taken weight from him that he could not afford to lose. His enormous hands were the same, but the arms above them were thinner, and the tremor Martin had noticed in November was visible now without needing to shake the man's hand. He had not reached his nephew. The storms had blocked the road north, and Krantz had spent 6 weeks in a settlement 50 miles upriver, trading labor for shelter, building a fireplace around out of river clay for a family that had never seen earthen work before. He had come back south because south was the direction his horse would go, and because, though he did not say this directly, Martin Hale's claim was the closest thing to a home the old man had left. Martin did not ask him to stay. He simply made room, a pallet beside the stove, a place at the table, a portion of whatever Eliza cooked. Krantz accepted without ceremony, the way a working man accepts a floor to sleep on and a fire to sit beside. They worked together through the rest of February. The cabin was finished, but the outbuildings were not. Martin had a lean-to for the goats and a half-roof storage frame for wood and tools, both of them uncoated, both of them bleeding heat and taking weather. Krantz and Martin coated the goat shelter first, a full shell of tempered clay over wattle, 2 inches thick, with a gravel apron and an extended drip edge that Krantz designed from split cottonwood and flat stones. The work was slower than it had been in October. Krantz moved carefully. His back troubled him. His breathing was audible when he lifted, a wet, rattling sound that he tried to suppress by turning away and coughing into his sleeve. Martin pretended not to hear it the first day. The second day, he repositioned the work so that the heavy lifting, the bucket carrying, the mixing fell to him, and Krantz did the shaping, the smoothing, the detail work that his hands still knew better than Martin's ever would. They disagreed once, and the disagreement mattered. Martin wanted to coat the storage frame with the same thick shell he had used on the cabin, full wattle, 3 lifts, rounded corners. Krantz said no. The storage frame did not need the same treatment. It was not a living space. It did not hold heat. It needed weather protection, a single heavy coat to keep the rain and snow off the wood, but not the thermal mass of the cabin walls. "You are building a kiln around a woodpile," Krantz said. "The wood does not need warmth. It needs to stay dry. One coat, thick at the base, a good cap. Save your labor for the things that must hold heat. If I build it right the first time, I do not have to rebuild. If you build too much the first time, you waste weeks on work that earns nothing. A wall around a sleeping child is worth 4 inches. A wall around a pile of cottonwood is worth 1. The clay does not care about pride, Martin. It cares about purpose. Martin pushed back. He had learned to build thick, to build thorough, to treat every surface as a potential failure point. The idea of doing less felt like cutting corners. But Krantz was not talking about cutting corners. He was talking about proportional effort, matching the investment to the need. A storage building that stayed dry was a storage building that worked. Encasing it in a full thermal shell was spending October labor for a September problem. Martin conceded. They coated the frame in a single heavy lift with extra attention at the base and roof line. It took 3 days instead of 2 weeks. Krantz was right. The frame shed water and blocked wind and did its job. In early March, Krantz did not get up. Martin found him on his pallet at dawn, awake but still, his hands flat on the blanket beside him, his breathing shallow and wet. His eyes were open and clear and calm in a way that told Martin everything before any words were spoken. "My chest," Krantz said. "It has been settling for a while now." "How long?" "Since before I came south the first time. The cold got in at Yankton and did not leave." Martin brought him water and stoked the fire. Eliza heated broth. The cabin was warm, the clay walls holding the night's accumulated heat, the stove bringing it back to full, and Krantz lay in that warmth and breathed in the shallow, measured way of a man who is rationing his air. He did not get up that day, or the next, or, on the third day, he sat up against the wall and ate a bowl of broth and talked to Martin for an hour while the afternoon sun heated the south face and the warmth came through the clay into the room. He talked about the brickyard at Yankton, the kilns he had built there, long, low structures that could fire 10,000 bricks at once if the clay was right and the fuel was steady. He talked about the way clay changes when it fires, the water leaving, the minerals bonding, the soft earth becoming stone. He said that a man who understood fire and clay understood most of what the world was made of, and that the rest was just details. He talked about his wife, whose name was Marta, who had died in the sod house in Nebraska, in a room that stayed warm all winter, but could not keep the consumption out. He said the walls had been the thickest he ever built, 2 feet of packed sod with a clay interior coat that held heat like a kiln. He said Marta had been warm every night of that last winter, and that warmth was all he had been able to give her, and that it had not been enough. He said the room had been warm enough, and the walls had been thick enough, and the only thing that had not been enough was time. Eliza sat beside him and listened to the story of Marta, and something in the girl's face shifted, a recognition that grief was not unique to her, that other people had lost the person they could not afford to lose and had kept building anyway. Then Krantz said the thing that Martin carried forward for the rest of his life. A wall fails from water before it fails from cold. Krantz's voice was thin but certain. The cold tests the wall, the wind tests the wall, but water kills the wall. Water gets into the clay and freezes and expands and opens cracks that the wind and the cold alone could never make. If you keep the water out, the rain, the runoff, the thaw, the drip from the roof, the wall lasts. If you let the water in, the wall dies. Remember that. When everything else goes wrong, check the water first. Krantz died on the 5th day of March, in the early morning, with the stove burning low and the walls warm. Martin was beside him. Eliza was asleep. The death was quiet, a slowing of breath, a stillness in the enormous hands, and then nothing. Martin sat with the body for an hour and did not move. There is a weight that settles on a room when the last breath leaves it. It is not grief exactly, though grief follows. It is the specific silence of a space that held a living person, and now holds the shape of their absence. The clay walls that Kranz had helped Martin build held that silence the way they held warmth, completely, without seams, giving nothing back to the wind. Martin buried Kranz on the rise beside Sarah, where the river curved below and the grass would come back green in April. He dug the hole himself, the way he had dug Sarah's hole, and Eliza stood beside him the way she had stood beside the wagon, and the ground was harder now, frozen deep, and the work took all day. The secondary crisis came 3 weeks later, and it came the way Kranz had predicted, through water. March brought thaw. The temperature climbed above freezing during the day and dropped below at night, and this cycling, warm, cold, was exactly the condition that destroyed earthen walls. Meltwater ran off the remaining snow, pooled against foundations, soaked into clay, froze at night, expanded, and cracked. The freeze-thaw cycle that Nels Torvik had warned about in October was real. It was happening, and it was happening first to Torvik himself. Torvik's north wall, the one he had coated in January with Martin's guidance, began showing cracks in the second week of March. Vertical cracks at first, drying cracks, the kind that Kranz had taught Martin to read as signs of too fast curing. Then horizontal cracks at the base, where runoff from the melting snow was pooling against the footing. Torvik had not built a gravel apron. He had not extended his drip edge. He had sealed the wall but left the base exposed. And now the water was doing exactly what water does to unprotected clay. Torvik rode to Martin's cabin on a morning when the thaw was running hard, and the ground was soft, and the air smelled like mud and spring, and the beginning of a new kind of trouble. "The base is cracking," Torvik said. "I can see it separating from the log. Another week of this and the whole lower section will slough off." Martin did not hesitate. He rode back with Torvik that afternoon, bringing tools, a bucket of pre-mixed slurry, and the gravel he had stockpiled for exactly this kind of repair. The work was urgent and technical, and Martin did it without Kranz beside him for the first time. He felt the absence like a missing hand, the moments when he would have turned to ask a question and found empty air, the pauses where Kranz's knuckle tap would have confirmed or corrected, the silence where the old man's accented voice would have said too fat or good or wait. He redirected the drainage first. Using a mattock borrowed from Torvik, he cut a shallow trench 18 inches uphill from the wall, angled to divert the meltwater around the cabin's north face and away into the low ground east of the yard. The trench was crude, cut fast in ground that was half frozen and half mud, but it moved the water. Within an hour, the pool that had been standing against the base of Torvik's wall was draining sideways instead of soaking into the clay. Then he packed gravel against the footing. He hauled river gravel in buckets, the same 300-yard carry he had done 100 times in October, and pressed it tight against the base of the wall, angled outward so that any water reaching the clay would hit stone and splash away. He built the apron 6 inches high and 18 inches wide, the dimensions Kranz had specified for his own cabin. The gravel was cold and wet, and Martin's hands went numb, working it into place. But the apron went on, and it stayed. Then he mixed a thin slurry, finer than the wall mix, almost liquid, with extra fine sand that he sifted through a piece of burlap, and worked it into the cracks with his fingers the way Kranz had shown him in November. He felt for the depth of each fracture, pressing the slurry in from the bottom, letting it fill the full width of the crack before moving up. The work was slow and precise, and his hands were stiff with cold, and he kept going because the cracks would not wait for warm weather, and neither would the next freeze. The repair took 2 days. When it was done, Torvik's base was sealed and drained and protected, and the cracks had stopped spreading. Torvik stood looking at the repaired wall with an expression Martin recognized. The same expression Martin had worn when Kranz corrected his mix in October. The look of a man who has just learned that the difference between success and failure is not the material or the method, but the attention paid to the thing most people overlook. Water, Martin said. Not cold, not wind. Water is what kills a clay wall. Keep the water out, and the wall holds. Let the water in, and everything you built will fail from the base up. He heard Kranz's voice in his own words and felt the weight of carrying knowledge that had been given to him by a man who was no longer alive to carry it himself. If this story reminds you that the things people laugh at are sometimes the things that save lives, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because Martin Hale was not just surviving anymore, he was teaching. And what he taught was spreading. Within a week, Ada Birch's husband came asking about drainage. The Cerny family rode over with their daughter to learn the spring maintenance, how to check for cracks, how to mix the repair slurry, how to read the base for water damage. Wiley Stiles sent word that his shanty walls had survived the thaw with only minor cracking because he had, by accident, piled gravel at the base when building, and it had served as an unintentional apron. Martin taught them all. He showed them the trench. He showed them the gravel. He showed them the slurry. He showed them how to press a thumb into the base of a clay wall after a thaw cycle, and read the firmness the way Kranz had taught him to read it. Solid meant safe. Soft meant water. Crumbling meant failure coming. People stopped calling the place Mud Rock, not all at once, not by decision. The name simply faded, the way names fade when the joke behind them stops being funny. What replaced it was nothing formal, just Martin Hale's place, or the Hale claim, or sometimes among the families who had coated their own walls, simply the clay cabin. Jonas Cray noticed the shift. He noticed it the way a man notices a current changing, not in the moment, but in the accumulated weight of small movements. Fewer people laughed at his counter when he mentioned the mud. Fewer people repeated the name, and more people quietly, without announcement, were riding to Martin's claim with questions about clay and drainage and mix ratios, and riding home with knowledge that Jonas could not sell and could not compete with and could not make disappear. Jonas tried a different approach. He acquired a small supply of clay from a separate source upriver and began offering to sell pre-mixed material to homesteaders who wanted to coat their walls but did not want to do the digging themselves. The price was steep. The quality was poor. Jonas did not know the mix ratios, did not temper the clay with enough fiber, did not understand the difference between river clay and upland soil. But he sold it because Jonas could sell anything, and 3 families bought the mix and applied it and waited. One of them, a man named Harker who had a claim south of the settlement, used Jonas's mix to coat a storage shed. The mix was too fat, the fiber too sparse, the application too thick in a single coat. Within 2 weeks of the spring thaw, the entire south wall slumped off the shed in a single wet sheet and fell into a pile at the base. Jonas blamed the weather. Harker blamed Jonas, and the settlement learned, without Martin needing to say a word, that the method was not simply mud on a wall. It was a system: mix, fiber, lifts, curing, drainage, maintenance, and cutting corners in any part of it meant failure in all of it. Martin did not gloat. He did not even mention it. He simply continued teaching whoever came to ask. And the people who came to ask now understood that what Martin was offering was not a trick, but a craft, learned from a man who had spent his life building with earth, passed forward by a man who had bet his daughter's life on it and won. The hostile skeptic had not been defeated. Jonas still stood behind his counter. Jonas still kept his ledger. Jonas still circled failure and profited from surrender. But the ground beneath his feet had shifted, and he could feel it, and the feeling made him quieter in a way that was not peace, but calculation. Spring deepened. The grass came back. The river ran high with snowmelt, and the cut bank exposed new seams of blue-gray clay, fresh and dense and ready. Martin looked at his cabin, the gray, rounded shape on the rise above the water, smoke lifting from the vent, Eliza in the doorway, and felt the specific sensation of a man who has survived something and must now decide what surviving means. He was no longer the man who had buried his wife in July and faced a winter that should have killed him. He was the man who had changed his walls and changed his odds, and was now changing other people's walls and other people's odds. The question was no longer whether he would survive. The question was what he would build. By the second summer on the claim, Martin Hale's days had a rhythm that would have been unrecognizable to the man who had stood in September with $6 in a leaking cabin and no idea whether he would survive December. He rose before dawn. He checked the walls, a habit that had become as automatic as breathing, a circuit of the cabin's exterior that took 5 minutes and told him everything he needed to know. Thumb into the base at 4 points. Knuckle tap on each face. Visual check of the drip edges and the gravel apron. If the night had been wet, he looked for pooling. If the night had been dry and windy, he looked for surface dusting, where the outermost layer of clay might be losing its bond. Most mornings, the walls told him nothing was wrong. On the mornings they told him something, he fixed it before breakfast. Then he fed the animals. The goats had survived the winter, and kidded in April, 2 does producing 3 kids between them, which meant milk and eventually meat or trade. The mule was sound and had put on weight since the snow melted, and the grass came back. Martin had cleared an acre for garden south of the cabin, and the soil near the river was black and deep and gave back more than he put in. Then the visitors came. It had started as a trickle in February and March. Torvik, the Birch family, the Stiles boy, the Kearneys. By summer it was steady. A family from 30 miles north rode 2 days to see the cabin because a teamster had described it on the freight road. A man building a new claim near the Rosebud sent his eldest son to learn the wattle technique. A group of 3 homesteaders from a settlement east of the river came together, pooling the cost of the trip, and spent 2 days watching Martin work and taking notes on scraps of paper and the backs of seed catalogs. Martin taught them all. He had become, without intention or announcement, the person people came to when they wanted to understand how to keep a house warm with less wood, less labor, and less fear. The teaching was always physical. He did not lecture. He walked people to the cut bank and made them dig clay with their own hands. He made them squeeze it and feel the density. He made them mix it with grass and manure and work it with their boots until they understood the texture that meant the fiber was distributed. He made them press their palms against the finished wall and hold them there. The moment of contact was always the same. The hand went flat against the clay. The eyes changed. The person felt the warmth, not hot, not dramatic, but steady and deep. The warmth of mass that had absorbed heat and refused to give it back. And in that moment they understood what Martin had understood in his father's shed 30 years ago, what Kranz had understood in 50 years of building with earth, what every person who has ever pressed a hand against a warm wall and felt the difference between shelter and exposure understands without needing words. He made them hold it there. That was the part most visitors did not expect. Martin would not let them pull their hand away after the first touch. He made them stand with their palm flat against the clay for a full minute, sometimes 2, until the warmth soaked through the skin and into the bones of the hand, until they could feel the wall not as a surface but as a body, a thing with depth and mass and stored energy. Then he walked them to the corner of the cabin where the bare logs of a tool rack stood exposed, uncoated, and made them press the same hand against the wood. The cold was immediate, sharp. The contrast was so stark that some visitors pulled back as though the wood had burned them. "That is the difference," Martin said. Every time. The same words, because the words did not matter. The hands did. Martin did not charge. When people offered to pay, he asked for labor instead. A day of hauling gravel, a half day of cutting willow, help splitting the cottonwood that he still needed for fuel. The economy was practical, not monetary. Knowledge for hands, skill for sweat. The settlement was beginning to function the way settlements function when one person has something everyone needs and is willing to share it for the cost of showing up. The second winter came and went. It was hard but not historic, steady cold, regular storms, deep drifts, but nothing approaching the sustained violence of the first. Martin's cabin performed the way it had been built to perform. 2 splits a night, warm walls, liquid water in the bucket at dawn. Eliza grew an inch and gained weight, and her cough did not return. The goats sheltered in their clay-coated lean-to, and the kids survived. Torvik's cabin, with its 2 coated faces, performed better than it had the year before. Not as well as Martin's, the coverage was partial. The corners were still sharp on the uncoated east side, but measurably better. Torvik burned 3 cords instead of 4.5. His wife did not burn grass. His son stayed healthy. Wiley Stiles' shanty held. The Cerny family's cabin, which they had coated over the summer with careful attention to the mix and the drainage, performed well enough that the eldest daughter told Martin it was the first winter her mother had not cried from the cold. The community was changing, not dramatically, not uniformly, but visibly to anyone who rode the river road and looked at the cabins. Here and there, a wall that was smooth instead of angular, a corner that curved instead of catching the wind, a gravel apron at the base of a structure that had not had one the year before. The changes were small and scattered, and they added up to something that mattered. Fewer families burning through their fuel before February. Fewer children sick from the cycling cold. Fewer men standing at Jonas Cray's counter asking about the price of someone else's abandoned claim. Jonas noticed. He noticed the way a storekeeper notices a change in traffic, not in the individual sale, but in the pattern. Fewer people were desperate. Fewer people were selling tools at loss. Fewer people were asking him to broker a claim transfer. The frontier was still hard. People still failed. But the specific failure that Jonas had built his side business on, the family that ran out of fuel because their cabin bled heat, was becoming less common, and Jonas could trace the reason directly to the man on the rise above the river, whose cabin looked like a boulder. Jonas did not confront Martin. Jonas was not a man who confronted. He maneuvered. He adapted. He found new angles. Through the second summer, he quietly began selling pre-mixed clay again, better this time, because he had paid attention to the failures of his first batch and adjusted the fiber content. He did not credit Martin for the knowledge. He did not acknowledge that his improved mix was a copy of what Martin taught freely. He simply sold it at markup to homesteaders who did not want to dig their own clay, and he pocketed the difference between free knowledge and packaged convenience. Martin did not object. A man selling clay mix, even badly, was still a man putting clay on walls, and walls with clay were walls that held heat. The method was bigger than the grudge, but the grudge was not finished with Jonas Cray. It came to its conclusion in the autumn of the second year, during a cold snap that arrived 3 weeks earlier than expected. Jonas had built a storage shed behind his store, a rough-framed structure that he had coated with his own commercial mix as a demonstration for customers. The shed was visible from the road. Jonas pointed it out to every buyer. "Look," he said, "clay works. I sell the mix. You can do this yourself, or I can sell you enough to coat whatever you need." The shed looked good. The clay was smooth and even. The corners were not rounded. Jonas had not understood that detail, or had not bothered with it, but the coverage was complete and the surface was presentable. What Jonas had not done was build a gravel apron. He had not extended the drip edge. He had not cut drainage away from the base. He had heard Martin explain these things to visitors, and had dismissed them as excessive caution, the fussing of a man who did not understand that good clay on a solid frame was enough. The autumn rains came first. 2 days of steady, soaking rain that puddled against the base of the shed and soaked into the lowest 6 inches of clay. Then the temperature dropped. The water in the clay froze. The ice expanded. Cracks opened at the base. Horizontal cracks. The kind Crans had taught Martin to read as separation cracks, the layers pulling apart because the bond had been broken by ice. Then a warm day. The ice melted. The water that had been holding the cracked clay in place drained away. And on the morning of the third day after the rain, the entire south wall of Jonas Cray's storage shed let go. The clay slid off the frame in a single heavy sheet, landing in a pile at the base with a sound like a sack of grain hitting a barn floor. The wattle, what little Jonas had used, hung off the frame in broken strands. The bare boards beneath were exposed, wet, and already starting to warp. The shed was visible from the road. Everyone who passed that day saw it. Everyone who stopped at the store saw it. Jonas stood behind his counter and said nothing about it, and his silence was louder than anything he had ever said about Martin Hale's mud. The shed stayed broken for a week. Jonas did not have the knowledge to fix it properly and did not want to admit it. He patched the exposed boards with canvas and weighted the canvas with stones and pretended the problem was temporary. Then a second cold snap came, harder than the first, and the canvas tore in the wind, and the remaining clay on the east wall cracked and slumped, and the shed was exposed on 2 sides with winter approaching. Jonas Cray rode to Martin Hale's claim on a Tuesday morning in late October. He tied his horse to the fence post, a real fence post now, cedar, set in gravel, and stood in the yard with his hands at his sides. Martin was at the trench, mixing clay for a repair coat on the goat shelter. Eliza was inside. The cabin sat on the rise behind them, gray and solid, smoke lifting from the vent. Jonas did not look at the cabin. He looked at the ground. "I need help with the shed," Jonas said. Martin kept mixing. He worked the clay with his boot, turning it, pressing it, folding the grass into the body of the mix. He did not look up. "The base failed," Jonas continued. "Both walls that face the weather. I patched it, but the patch did not hold." "Did you build an apron?" Martin said. "No." "Did you cut drainage?" "No." "Did you extend the drip?" "No." Martin stopped mixing and looked at Jonas. The storekeeper's face was tight. His jaw was set. His eyes were steady, but his hands, hanging at his sides, were not. This was a man who had made a career of buying other people's failures, standing in the yard of the man he had mocked, asking for the knowledge he had dismissed, because the alternative was watching his own shed fail in public for the rest of the winter. Martin did not gloat. He did not remind Jonas of the hog wallow or the mud grave or the years of mockery that had traveled the settlement on Jonas's tongue. He did not say anything about the families who had been discouraged from trying the method because Jonas had called it foolish. He did not say anything at all about the past. He said, "Clay is honest. It only does what you built it to do." Then he put down the mixing board and said, "I will come tomorrow." He rode to Jonas's store the next morning and spent 2 days fixing the shed. He stripped the failed clay. He built a gravel apron. He extended the drip edge with split boards. He cut drainage trenches on both weather-facing sides. He mixed a proper batch, tempered with grass and manure, worked until the fiber ran through it, and applied it in 2 lifts with 3 days between them. He rounded the corners. He sealed the base. Jonas watched every step. He did not ask questions. He did not offer to help. He stood behind his counter when Martin was inside the store and stood in the yard when Martin was outside. and he watched the way a man watches something he is being forced to understand. When the work was done, Jonas offered to pay. Martin said no. Jonas offered credit at the store. Martin said no. Jonas stood in the silence that followed and looked at the repaired shed, and looked at Martin and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not be an admission, and Jonas Cray was not yet the kind of man who could admit. But he stopped selling the inferior mix. He stopped making jokes at the counter. And when customers asked about clay coating, he did something he had never done before. He sent them to Martin. It was not conversion. It was not friendship. It was the grudging, minimal acknowledgement of a man who had been proven wrong by physics and weather, and the specific, patient stubbornness of a wall that did what it was built to do. It was enough. Ruth Bell arrived in the spring of 1882. She was Ezra Bell's younger sister, 41 years old, widowed 2 years earlier when her husband died of a burst appendix on a cattle drive in Wyoming. She had come to Dakota to live near her brother because she had no other family and no other options, and because Ezra had written that the settlement needed hands, and that Ruth's hands were among the most capable he knew. She was tall and thin, and quiet in the way of women who have learned that speaking wastes energy better spent on work. She had run a boarding house in Cheyenne for 3 years after her husband's death, and had kept it solvent through 2 economic downturns and a fire that took the kitchen. She understood labor. She understood books. She understood the specific arithmetic of keeping people fed and sheltered on a margin that left no room for sentiment. Ezra brought her to Martin's claim on her 3rd day in the settlement. He did not explain why. He simply said, "You should see this," and rode her up the river road to the rise where the gray cabin sat, with smoke lifting from the vent and the spring sun warming the south wall. Ruth dismounted and walked the perimeter the way her brother had walked it, with her hands. She pressed her palm to the south face. She crouched at the gravel apron. She tapped the northwest corner. She stood at the door and looked at the sealed frame and the controlled vent and the narrow window slit and the smooth, continuous surface that turned the cabin from a structure into a shape. Then she turned to Martin, who was standing by the trench with clay on his boots and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, and she said, "How often does the base need maintenance? Not how does it work? Not why did you do it? Not is it warm?" She asked the maintenance question, which was the question of a person who understood that anything built must be kept, and that the keeping was where most people failed. "Twice a year," Martin said. "Once after the spring thaw, once before freeze-up. Check the apron. Check the drip edge. Fill any cracks with slurry. If the base has softened, strip it and rebuild with fresh gravel and a new first coat." Ruth nodded. "Show me." Martin showed her. He showed her the way he showed everyone, at the cut bank, at the trench, at the wall, with his hands and her hands and the clay between them. But Ruth learned faster than anyone he had taught, because Ruth did not learn by watching. She learned by doing, and the doing was immediate and precise and without hesitation. She mixed the clay and worked it and pressed it and read the cracks and understood the drainage and asked the questions that mattered, not how thick but how long, not how many lifts but how many seasons, not whether it worked but what made it fail. She came back the next week to help coat a neighbor's cabin, the Birch place, whose north wall had survived the winter with Martin's guidance but whose west wall still leaked. Ruth mixed the clay herself, working the trench with her boots the way Martin had taught her, checking the fiber distribution by squeezing a fistful and watching whether the grass showed evenly through the cross-section. Her lifts were even. Her application was cleaner than Martin's had been at the same stage, neater edges, smoother surfaces, tighter bonds where the new coat met the old. She had the hands of a woman who had run a boarding house kitchen and kept every surface level and every measurement precise, and those hands translated directly into clay work. Martin watched her rebuild the birch west wall and saw something he had not expected to see again after Kranz's death. Another person who understood the material, not copied it, understood it. Ruth read the clay the way crayons had read it, by feel and by resistance, and by the color of the surface as it cured. She asked why the base coat was thicker than the top coat, and when Martin explained that the base carried the weight of every layer above it and therefore needed more mass, she nodded once and never asked again. She understood load and structure the way a woman who has balanced books and fed 20 boarders on a thin margin understands that the foundation of any system is what carries everything else. She came back the week after that, and the week after that. The visits lengthened. A morning became an afternoon. An afternoon became a shared supper at Martin's table, with Eliza setting 3 plates instead of 2 and not commenting on the change. Ruth brought food, bread from her brother's kitchen, dried apple slices she had carried from Cheyenne, a jar of honey she had traded for at the store. Martin provided the work and the company and the clay. They did not court the way settlement romances were supposed to proceed. No Sunday visits, no formal introductions, no carefully brokered conversations between families. They courted the way 2 people court when both of them have buried a spouse and learned that love is not a feeling but a practice. They courted through clay, through shared meals after long days of hauling and mixing, through the specific trust that comes from handing someone a full bucket and knowing they will carry it steady, through the small negotiations of 2 adults learning each other's rhythms, who wakes first, who stokes the fire, who checks the walls, who remembers to bring in the tools before the rain, through Eliza, who watched Ruth work with the careful attention of a girl who had not had a woman's hands in her life for 2 years and recognized them when they returned. Eliza did not call Ruth mother. She called her Ruth. But she sat closer to her at the table than she sat to anyone, and she asked Ruth questions she had never asked Martin about Cheyenne, about cooking, about what her mother might have thought of the clay cabin. And Ruth answered them with the honesty of a woman who understood that a child who has lost her mother does not want comfort. She wants truth. Martin and Ruth married in the autumn of 1882, in a quiet ceremony at the settlement with Ezra Bell standing witness and Eliza holding a bundle of late-season wildflowers she had picked from the river bottom. They moved into the clay cabin, the gray, rounded shape on the rise that had once been a joke and was now simply home. The years compressed the way years do when the crisis has passed and life settles into the rhythm of seasons. Martin improved the cabin. He added a second room framed in log and coated in clay for Eliza as she grew into a young woman who could mix tempered clay faster than any man in the settlement and read a wall crack from 20 feet. He built a proper barn with clay-coated windward walls and rounded corners and a gravel apron that Ruth maintained with the precision she had brought to every ledger she had ever kept. He expanded the garden. He added chickens, and then a second mule, and then a milk cow that Eliza named Sarah without anyone asking her to explain why. Ruth brought order. She kept the accounts that Martin had never kept, the tally of who had come to learn, the record of which families had coded and which had not, the inventory of tools and seed, and stored food that turned a homestead from a survival exercise into a working operation. She also brought a warmth to the cabin that had nothing to do with the walls. A voice at the table, a hand on Eliza's shoulder, a presence beside the stove on winter evenings that reminded Martin what it felt like to build something with someone instead of alone. They had a son in 1884. They named him August, and when the boy was old enough to stand, Martin pressed his palm against the interior wall of the cabin and held it there until the child felt the warmth, the way Clement Hale had once pressed his son's palm against a clay kiln wall in the mountains of North Carolina. The boy pulled his hand away and put it back. He did not understand what the wall was or why it was warm. He only knew that his father's hand was beside his own, and the wall was kind, and that was enough for the beginning of an education that would continue for years. The method continued to spread, not as a revolution, not as a movement, as a practice passed hand to hand, wall to wall, claim to claim. By the middle of the decade, A traveler on the river road could count at least a dozen structures with visible clay coating, some full shells, some partial, some crude, and some careful, but all of them evidence that a single man's desperate gamble in the autumn of 1880 had changed the way a small piece of the Dakota frontier thought about shelter. Martin taught people he had never met. Families arrived from settlements he had never heard of, sent by someone who had been sent by someone who had learned from Torvik or Stiles or the Kearneys, the knowledge branching outward, the way all useful knowledge branches, not through books or lectures, but through the simple human act of showing someone what works and trusting them to carry it forward. He taught a Norwegian family named Flaten how to read their local clay, which was sandier than the river blue-gray and needed more manure to bind. He taught a widower from Ohio how to coat a half dugout that was part sod and part timber, a hybrid structure that required different techniques at the seam where earth met wood. He taught two brothers named Hargis, who had built a schoolhouse for the settlement's children and wanted the walls to hold warmth through the short days of the school term, without burning through the modest fuel the families had contributed. Each teaching was different because each wall was different, and each family situation demanded its own adaptation. But the core was the same: the cut bank, the mix, the fiber, the lifts, the drainage, the maintenance, the palm pressed flat against the cured surface, held there until the warmth came through. Martin never claimed credit. When people called it the Hale method, he corrected them. He said it was his father's knowledge and August Kranz's skill and the river's clay and the prairie's grass. He said the only thing he had added was the specific desperation of a man who could not cut enough wood to keep his daughter alive and had to find another way. That was not modesty. That was accuracy. The technique was ancient. Earth building was as old as human shelter itself. What Martin had done was translate it from a Carolina kiln to a Dakota cabin, from a Volga German brickmaker's hands to a widower's desperate autumn, from knowledge that existed in scattered inherited forms to a specific teachable system adapted to the open plains and the killing wind. Ezra Bell died in 1886 from pneumonia in a cabin that his sister had coated the year before. The cabin was warm when he died. Ruth was beside him. Martin built the coffin from cedar he had been saving for fence posts, and Eliza dug the grave beside Sarah and August Krantz on the rise above the river, where the row of stones was becoming a kind of history. Within 5 seasons of the hard winter, at least 14 families along the river and in the wider settlement had applied some version of Martin's clay shell method to their homes and outbuildings. The number was not dramatic. It was not a transformation of the territory. It was a small, local, specific change, the kind of change that does not appear in history books, but appears in the survival of families who would otherwise have burned through their fuel and frozen in the gap between what they had and what they needed. Martin Hale lived out his life on the same claim, where Sarah was buried, and where Eliza had nearly died in the storm, and where August Kranz had pressed his thumb into the clay and said, "Too fat." He repaired the walls every spring and every autumn, the way Kranz had taught him, the way he taught everyone who came to learn. The clay required maintenance. It was not permanent. It was not a miracle. It was a material that did what you built it to do, and if you maintained it, it held, and if you neglected it, it failed. Martin understood that bargain and kept his end of it until the day he died, in 1903, in the clay cabin on the rise, with Ruth beside him, and the stove burning low and the walls warm. On a winter morning years after the hard winter, a traveler on the river road slowed his horse and looked up at the rise, where a smooth gray shape sat in the snow. The shape did not read as a cabin. It read as something that belonged to the ground, a boulder, a ridge, a piece of the earth itself, with smoke breathing from a narrow vent and a cleared path to a door cut into the south face. Farther along the road, the traveler could see other cabins, sharp-edged and angular, with frost showing white at every seam and drifts packed hard against every corner. They looked cold. They looked like what they were, Wooden boxes set on the open plain, fighting the wind and losing. The gray shape did not look cold. It did not look like it was fighting anything. It looked like it had made its peace with the ground and the wind and the winter had agreed to let it stand. Jonas Cray had said it years ago in the voice of a man who thought he was delivering a verdict. "You ain't built a house, Hale. You've buried one." He had meant it as dismissal. He had meant it as the final word on a fool's project. But Jonas had been right in a way he never intended, because Martin Hale had buried his house. And the buried house had held, and the house that held had kept his daughter alive and taught a settlement how to survive and outlasted every sharp-edged, conventional, properly built cabin that the wind could find a seam in. Inside the cabin, a child pressed a small palm flat against the interior wall, the way Martin had once pressed his palm against his father's kiln, the way Eliza had pressed hers, the way August Krantz had pressed his enormous thumb into the wet clay and felt for the truth of the mix. The wall was warm, not hot, not dramatic. Warm the way the earth is warm when it has been asked to hold something and has agreed. The child held the palm there and felt the heat come through, steady and deep and patient. And outside the wind ran across the plains the way it always had and always would, searching for a seam it could not find,